It was not the blade that destroyed Marie Antoinette. By the time the guillotine came into view, tall and indifferent against the Paris sky, the work had already been done. What remained of her was not broken by steel, but hollowed by time's silence and deliberate cruelty. History prefers the simplicity of executions. A single moment, a falling blade, an ending. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Long before the crowd gathered, long before the drums rolled, long before death was announced as justice, Marie Antoinette had already been dismantled piece by piece. Paris in the early 1790s was a city breathing anger. The streets no longer smelled of perfume and candle wax, but of damp stone, sweat, and hunger. Bread lines stretched endlessly. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Every face carried suspicion. Every gathering felt dangerous. The revolution had promised liberation, but what it delivered was fear sharpened into doctrine. In this climate, people did not look for nuance. They looked for enemies. And Marie Antoinette had become the most useful enemy of all. She was no longer seen as a woman, or even as a fallen queen. She was a symbol onto which an entire nation poured its resentment. Every empty stomach, every lost son, every unpaid debt found convenient shape in her name. Pamphlets reduced her to a caricature, grotesque and obscene. Artists exaggerated her features. Writers invented crimes. The truth was irrelevant. Hatred did not need accuracy. It needed repetition. Yet none of this began with malice. It began with a child. Born in Vienna in 1755, Maria Antonia was raised in the shadow of power, but not its control. She was one daughter among many, trained not to rule but to perform. Her value lay in marriage, not agency. At 14 years old, she was sent across Europe to become the wife of the French Dauphin. She left her home, her language, her identity behind, and stepped into a court that watched her breathe. Versailles was not a palace of comfort. It was a machine, a place where every gesture carried political weight, where intimacy was regulated and privacy was treated as a privilege rather than a right. Even dressing in the morning was a public ceremony, governed by rank and ritual. Who handed her a garment mattered. Who stood closest mattered. She learned quickly that nothing belonged to her, not even her own body. When she failed to produce an heir in the early years of her marriage, the whispers began. They always do. She was frigid. She was arrogant. She was unfit. No one considered her age. No one considered isolation. Blame found her easily because she was foreign, because she was visible, because she could not disappear. Time passed. Children were born. But by then, France itself was unraveling. Decades of war and mismanagement had drained the treasury. The social divide widened until it became impossible to ignore. While the aristocracy maintained appearances, the people struggled to survive. Anger needed a face, and Marie Antoinette's face was everywhere. The lie that would follow her into the grave was born in this period. Let them eat cake. For words she never spoke, but that captured perfectly what the public wanted to believe. That she was cruel, that she was indifferent, that she laughed while others starved. Once spoken, the phrase became truth through repetition. It was easier to hate a monster than to confront a broken system. When revolution erupted in 1789, it did not explode all at once. It crept, it grew, it fed on fear. And as the old order collapsed, the royal family found themselves trapped inside a city that no longer recognized them as human. Their movements were watched, their words dissected, their safety eroded daily. In 1791, they attempted to flee. It was not a dramatic escape, but a desperate one. Disguised, cramped inside a carriage, they moved slowly to the countryside, hoping anonymity would shield them. It did not. They were recognized, stopped, and forced back toward Paris. As the carriage rolled through hostile towns, crowds gathered. They spat on the windows. They screamed insults. Children were lifted onto shoulders to witness the humiliation. That journey marked the true end, not a monarchy as an institution, but their humanity in the public eye. From that point on, their lives ceased to belong to them. They were prisoners, even before the doors closed. They were first confined in the Tuileries, then transferred to the Temple, a fortress whose walls had witnessed centuries of violence. Conditions tightened. Guards multiplied. Communication with the outside world was severed. Letters were censored or never delivered. Conversations were overheard. Silence became a constant companion. And then came the cruelty that would haunt her more than any insult or threat. Her son was taken from her. He was only 8 years old, torn from her arms under the pretense of education and protection. In reality, he was handed over to men who believed loyalty could be beaten into shape. He was isolated, manipulated, neglected. They sought to turn him against his mother, to extract statements that could be used as weapons. Marie Antoinette begged for him. She pleaded. She demanded. None of it mattered. The separation was intentional. It was not about security. It was about breaking her. From that moment, something inside her changed. Those who saw her later would say the transformation was visible. The fear remained, but beneath it grew something else. A hardened stillness. A grief, so deep it left no room for panic. In August 1793, she was transferred again. This time to the Conciergerie. The Conciergerie was not a prison. It was a waiting room for death. Its corridors echoed with footsteps that often never returned. Its walls were soaked with moisture and memory. The air itself felt heavy, as if it remembered everyone who had passed through and never left. Her cell was small and exposed. Water seeped through the stone. A straw mattress lay on the floor. A bucket served as sanitation. A window, placed too high to see the sky, allowed in just enough light to remind her of time passing. But the worst feature of the cell was not the cold or the filth. It was the eyes. 2 guards were assigned to watch her constantly, day and night. They were instructed never to look away. She could not sleep without being observed. She could not change clothes without being observed. She could not kneel to pray without being observed. When she asked for privacy, she was ignored or mocked. This was not about preventing escape. It was about domination. Her name was removed from official records. She was referred to only as the widow Capet, a deliberate erasure. Queen, wife, mother, each identity stripped away until only a number remained. Food was minimal, often stale. Sleep came in fragments. Sounds traveled to the prison. Chains, distant cries, doors slamming shut. Sometimes silence followed, and everyone knew what that meant. Those who encountered her during this period remarked on her appearance. Her hair had begun to turn white. Her body grew thin. Her face hollowed. Yet they also noted her composure. She did not scream. She did not beg. She endured. One of the few people to treat her with kindness was a young servant named Rosalie. She brought food and occasionally spoke softly, offering what comfort she could. Rosalie would later testify that Marie Antoinette never complained about her own suffering. She spoke only of her children. At night, she clutched a small portrait of her son, pressing it to her chest as if it were still alive. Guards tried to take it from her. She resisted silently, fiercely. It was all she had left. Outside the prison walls, Paris grew louder. Trials were held daily. Executions became routine. The guillotine worked without pause. Death lost its ability to shock. And in this atmosphere, plans were made for her trial, not to determine guilt, but to create a spectacle, something that would justify everything that had been done to her, and everything that was still to come. By the time her name was called, the outcome was already written. What remained was not justice, but performance. And she, stripped of everything else, was about to be placed at the center of it. When the day of her trial arrived, the Conciergerie felt different. The air carried a tension sharper than usual, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. Marie Antoinette had not slept. Sleep had become an unfamiliar thing. Short, shallow intervals broken by footsteps and memory. When the guards opened her cell, their movements were brisk, almost impatient. There was no ceremony, no announcement worthy of a former queen. Only an order to stand, to move, to obey. She was escorted through corridors slick with moisture and shadow. Prisoners watched from behind iron bars, some curious, some indifferent, some already resigned to the same fate. The sound of chains echoed as doors opened and closed behind her, sealing each passage like punctuation marks in a sentence already written. The revolutionary tribunal was crowded long before she arrived. This was not a courtroom in the traditional sense. It was a theater. The audience had come not to hear evidence, but to witness humiliation. Vendors whispered in corners. Guards struggled to maintain order. Faces leaned forward in anticipation. They wanted confirmation of what they believed. They wanted to see the monster. She was brought in and seated on a simple wooden bench. No elevation. No separation. Just another accused awaiting judgment. The prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, wasted no time. His voice was sharp practice, designed to inflame. He spoke of treason, of conspiracies with foreign powers, of money stolen from starving people. Each accusation was met with murmurs of approval. The crowd had heard these charges before. Repetition had turned them into certainty. Marie Antoinette listened without interruption. She did not interrupt. She did not protest. When forced to respond, her answers were brief, precise, devoid of drama. She did not attempt to defend the monarchy. She did not argue politics. She knew better. The trial was not about facts. It was about erasure. Hours passed. Witnesses were called. Some spoke from genuine belief. Others repeated rumors as if they were testimony. Documents were waived dramatically, their contents barely examined. Every word was crafted to feed the audience's appetite. And then, when the tension was high enough, the final accusation was introduced. She was accused of incest with her son. The room froze. This was not merely an allegation. It was a calculated strike, meant to obliterate her completely, to strip her of the last refuge left to her, moral identity. The charge was based on statements extracted from the child, isolated and manipulated, encouraged to say what adults wanted to hear. The revolution did not hesitate to use a child as a weapon. For a moment, Marie Antoinette did not move. Her face remained still, but something in the room shifted. Even those who had shouted moments before grew quiet. The accusation was so vile that it cut through the noise of hatred. She stood slowly. She did not turn toward the judges. She did not look at the prosecutor. Instead, she turned to the women in the audience. Market women, mothers, those who had marched on Versailles years earlier, shouting for bread and justice. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, controlled. She appealed to them not as a queen, but as a mother. She said she could not answer such an accusation. She trusted them to understand. The silence that followed was profound. Some women lowered their heads. Others wept openly. In that moment, the caricature shattered. The obscene pamphlets, the invented stories, the monstrous image, all of it faltered. What stood before them was not the embodiment of excess, but but a woman who had already lost her child and was now being accused of the unthinkable. The prosecutor slammed his hand on the table, attempting to regain control. The trial moved on, but the damage was done. The spectacle had cracked. Not enough to save her, but enough to expose the cruelty behind it. The proceedings dragged on for 2 days. The outcome never changed. Guilty of high treason. Sentenced to death. When asked if she had anything to add, she replied simply that she had said everything she needed to say. There was no speech. No plea. The dignity she maintained infuriated those who wanted her broken. She was returned to the Conciergerie under heavy guard. The prison swallowed her again, its damp corridors closing behind her. The cell looked smaller than before. The straw mattress thinner. The walls closer. She sat at the small wooden table and rested her forehead in her hands. There were no tears. Grief had long since exhausted them. That night, she asked for paper and ink. The guards hesitated, then complied. Perhaps they believed it no longer mattered. She sat beneath the flickering candle and began to write. The quill shook slightly in her hand, not from fear, but from weakness. She did not write about the trial. She did not condemn the revolution. She wrote to her sister-in-law, expressing love, sorrow, and forgiveness. She spoke of her children, of her son. She asked that he not be blamed for what he had been forced to say, that he be protected from further cruelty, that he be loved. Each word was deliberate, calm, final. When she finished, she placed a letter on the table. The candlelight illuminated the fresh ink, dark against the paper. That letter would be confiscated, hidden away, its contents deemed too dangerous. Even her forgiveness was a threat. Afterward, she knelt on the cold stone floor and prayed, not for rescue, not for justice. She prayed for strength, for peace, for the courage to meet death without hatred. She prayed for her children, wherever they were, whatever had become of them. When she rose, those who later saw her would say something had changed. The fear was gone. In its place was acceptance. She slept briefly, her head resting on her arm beside the letter she would never send. At dawn, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Louder, faster. The door opened. A guard announced it was time. Rosalie, the young servant who had shown her kindness, was there. Her eyes were red. Marie Antoinette took her hands and told her not to cry. She said she had suffered too much to fear death now. She was ordered to change clothes. She asked for privacy. The request was denied. Guards remained as she undressed. There was no modesty left to violate. They handed her a plain white linen dress, coarse and shapeless. A garment designed not for comfort, but for anonymity. A dress to die in. The executioner arrived to cut her hair. She bowed her head without resistance. The scissors were dull. Strands fell unevenly to the floor, gray and white mixed together. Each cut erased another trace of her former self. When it was finished, her hands were bound tightly behind her back. The rope bit into her wrists. She commented quietly that her husband's hands had not been bound. No one replied. When they let her out of the cell, she walked steadily. Her posture was straight, her steps measured. The guards, hardened men who had seen countless prisoners break, later said her calm unsettled them. It was not defiance. It was something colder, something deeper. The conciergerie doors opened and cold morning air rushed in. A cart waited in the courtyard, the same open wagon used to transport common criminals. There would be no final courtesy, no special treatment. She climbed in without assistance. As the cart began to move, Paris slowly revealed itself. Streets lined with faces, some shouting, some laughing, others watching in silence. She did not respond to any of it. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, as if the crowd no longer existed. An artist watching from a window opened his notebook and began to draw. What he saw was not the lavish Queen of Versailles, but an austere figure stripped to essentials. That image would survive long after the shouting faded. The cart rolled on, stone wheels rattling, carrying her toward the place where history would remember her death. But the true cruelty had already taken its toll. Everything that could be taken had been taken. What remained was something the revolution could not understand, and therefore could not destroy. The cart moved slowly through the streets of Paris, each jolt of the wheels over uneven stones sending a dull shock through her body. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back, the rope cutting into skin already weakened by confinement and hunger. She did not adjust her posture. She did not lean for balance. She allowed herself to sway with emotion, as if her body no longer belonged to her, as if she were already halfway beyond it. The morning was cold and heavy with fog. It clung to buildings and faces alike, muting the city's colors into shades of gray. Windows opened as the cart passed. People emerged from alleys and doorways, drawn by the sound of hooves and murmurs that rippled outward like a signal. Some shouted insults learned from pamphlets. Some laughed, eager to witness the end of a story they believed they understood. Others remained silent, watching expressions they did not yet know how to name. What unsettled many was not her presence, but her absence of reaction. Marie Antoinette did not look down. She did not scan the crowd. She did not search for pity. Her eyes were fixed forward, unfocused, as if resting on something none of them could see. It was the stillness of someone who had already accepted the outcome long before it was announced. As the cart passed through one of the narrower streets, a man leaned from a balcony with a sketchbook in his hands. He had drawn many executions before. The guillotine had become a recurring subject, its geometry precise, its symbolism unmistakable. But what he saw that morning compelled him to draw not the machine, but the woman approaching it, stripped of ornament, hair cut unevenly, dressed in coarse white fabric. She appeared almost spectral, not defiant, not broken, simply present. That drawing would later circulate, offering a different memory than the one the crowd had come to witness. The cart turned, and the square opened before them. The place de la Revolution was already full. Thousands pressed forward, bodies packed tightly together, breath visible in the cold air. At the center stood the guillotine, tall and dark against the pale sky. Its blade caught the light faintly, unmoved by the noise surrounding it. The platform beneath it bore the marks of countless executions. The wood was stained and worn smooth by repetition. Death here was no longer extraordinary. It was procedural. The cart came to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd leaned in. The executioner stepped forward and offered his hand to help her down. She looked at him, then shook her head, slightly. She did not want assistance. Slowly, carefully, she descended on her own. Her bound hands made balance difficult, but she did not stumble. Each step was deliberate. As she approached the scaffold, the wind lifted the hem of her dress. It fluttered briefly, giving her an almost weightless appearance. She climbed the steps, the wood creaking beneath her feet. At the top, she turned to position herself as instructed. In doing so, her foot accidentally brushed against the executioner's. It was a minor, insignificant contact, yet she stopped and spoke. She apologized, not loudly, not for effect, simply and sincerely. It was an instinct ingrained through a lifetime of etiquette and restraint, a final gesture of humanity in a place designed to erase it. Those close enough to hear would later recall that moment with discomfort. The apology did not belong there. It reminded them that the woman before them was still a woman. The executioner adjusted the apparatus. The crowd fell silent. For a brief instant, the square seemed to hold its breath. Then the blade fell. The sound was sharp and final. The crowd erupted. Cheers broke out. Cries of triumph echoed across the square. The executioner lifted her severed head and displayed it, as custom demanded. Some claimed later that her expression remained calm, almost peaceful, even in death. Whether that was truth or projection, it mattered little. The ritual had been completed. The revolution had claimed its victory. Her body was placed in a simple coffin and transported, without ceremony, to a mass grave. There was no marker, no name, no acknowledgement of who she had been. She was buried like a criminal, among many others whose identities were deemed unworthy of remembrance. The revolution believed this final act would erase her completely. It did not. In the days that followed, Paris moved on. Another execution replaced the last. New enemies were named. New trials announced. The machinery of terror continued its rhythm, yet something lingered beneath the surface. Witnesses spoke quietly of her composure. Guards who had watched her spoke of her silence. Even those who hated her found themselves unsettled by the memory. The revolution had wanted to destroy a symbol. What it had revealed instead was a human being enduring systematic cruelty without surrendering her dignity. That contradiction proved difficult to contain. Years passed. The terror consumed its own architects. Leaders who had ordered executions found themselves accused by the same mechanisms they had empowered. The guillotine did not discriminate for long. It devoured names, faces, and convictions alike. As the political climate shifted, history began to reconsider what had been done. Accounts emerged from archives. Letters were rediscovered. Testimonies recorded. The image of Marie Antoinette as a monstrous tyrant began to fracture. In its place emerged a more complex figure, flawed, privileged, but also isolated, targeted, and subjected to cruelty that exceeded necessity. Decades later, after the monarchy had been restored, her remains were located. They had lain anonymously for years, their exact position forgotten. When they were finally exhumed, they were identified and transferred to the royal burial site. A grave was prepared, a ceremony held. The woman denied dignity in death was granted it long after, but the question remained. Why had it been necessary to break her so completely before killing her? Execution alone would have sufficed. The revolution had proven it could remove kings swiftly and efficiently. Yet with Marie Antoinette, something else had been pursued. Humiliation, isolation, psychological erosion, the stripping of identity, the removal of motherhood, the accusation designed not to convict, but to annihilate. These were not accidents of chaos. They were deliberate choices. They reflected a fear deeper than political opposition. The fear that if she died with dignity intact, the narrative would fail. That if the enemy retained humanity, the justification for cruelty would weaken. And so every effort was made to reduce her to something unrecognizable before the blade ever fell. What remains most unsettling is not her death, but the calm with which she faced it. A calm forged not in privilege, but in loss. By the time she stepped onto the scaffold, she had already endured the worst. Everything that mattered to her had been taken. Fear had nothing left to threaten her with. History often teaches revolutions as moral necessities, as cleansing fires that burn away corruption. But fires do not choose their victims carefully. They consume what is near, and sometimes in their hunger, they reveal more about those who light them than those they destroy. Marie Antoinette was not a saint. She was not innocent of excess. But the cruelty inflicted upon her exceeded any measure of justice. It crossed into something else. A demonstration. A warning. A spectacle meant to satisfy rage rather than resolve it. And that is why her story endures. Not because she was a queen, but because she was reduced to less than a person and still refused to abandon her humanity. Because in the face of calculated degradation, she offered restraint. In the presence of hatred, she offered silence. And in her final moment, she offered an apology instead of a curse. The guillotine ended her life, but it did not erase her. The cruelty meant to destroy her instead carved her into memory as a reminder of how far society can go once it convinces itself that someone no longer deserves to be human. That is the part history struggles to reconcile. Not the execution itself, but everything that made it possible. In the years after her death, silence settled over the place where Marie Antoinette had fallen. The place the Law Revolution was renamed. Statues were erected and removed. Blood was washed from the stones. But memory is not so easily erased. People who had stood in that crowd carried the image with them, whether they admitted it or not. Some remembered the cheers. Others remembered the stillness before the blade fell. And a few remembered something that disturbed them far more than the execution itself. The calm of the woman who had nothing left to lose. The revolution continued, devouring its own architects. Men who had demanded her humiliation were themselves accused, imprisoned, and led to the same scaffold. The machinery they had perfected turned without mercy. Fear replaced certainty. Suspicion replaced unity. The moral clarity promised at the beginning dissolved into survival. In that chaos, Marie Antoinette's name resurfaced, not as propaganda, but as a question. Had it all been necessary? The records, when examined later, revealed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The isolation, the constant surveillance, the refusal of privacy, the calculated removal of her child, the incest accusation designed not to prove guilt, but to annihilate her reputation beyond repair. None of these were spontaneous acts of mob rage. They were policies, decisions made in rooms far from the prison cell, justified as safeguards of the revolution. What terrified those in power was not that she might escape or that she might reclaim authority. It was that she might die as something more than a villain, that she might retain dignity. Because dignity complicates narratives. It forces reflection. It undermines absolutes. The revolution needed her to be less than human, so that her destruction could feel righteous. And yet, in the end, it failed to achieve that goal. Accounts from guards and witnesses describe a woman who adapted to suffering without surrendering herself to it. She did not lash out. She did not beg. She did not perform despair for an audience. Her resistance was quiet, internal, and therefore uncontrollable. That kind of resistance cannot be paraded as victory. It lingers, unsettling and unresolved. When her remains were finally recovered years later, the ceremony was subdued. There were no triumphal speeches, no declarations of justice fulfilled, only a recognition that something irreversible had been done, that history had moved too fast, too violently, and had crushed more than it needed to. The irony is impossible to ignore. The revolution sought to erase monarchy, to destroy the symbols of inherited power and excess. But in doing so, it created a new symbol one it could not control. Not the queen in diamonds, but the prisoner in white linen. Not the woman of privilege, but the mother deprived of her child. Not the caricature, but the human being. That is why her final moments matter more than her execution. When she apologized to the executioner, it was not an act of submission. It was an assertion of self, a refusal to let hatred define her last words. In a system built to reduce her to an object, she insisted, quietly, on being a person. History often teaches us to measure cruelty by its visible outcomes, by bodies, by numbers, by dates. But the most profound cruelty is often invisible. It is a slow erosion of identity, the denial of privacy, the manipulation of love into a weapon, the deliberate attempt to make someone forget who they are before they die. Marie Antoinette endured all of that, and in enduring it, she exposed something deeply uncomfortable. That cruelty does not require monsters. It requires justification. It requires belief. It requires people who convince themselves that humiliation is necessary, that suffering is deserved, that the end excuses every means. This is not a story about absolution. It is not an attempt to transform her into a martyr or a saint. It is a reminder that history is rarely clean, that victims and symbols can occupy the same body, that revolutions, no matter how justified their origins, can lose their moral footing when they stop seeing people and start seeing targets. When we reduce someone to a symbol, we grant ourselves permission to do anything to them. That is a lesson hidden beneath the spectacle of the guillotine. Not that a queen died, but that a society decided humiliation was acceptable before death. That breaking a woman psychologically was not only allowed, but encouraged. That stripping someone of motherhood, dignity, and identity could be framed as justice. And once that line is crossed, it rarely holds. Marie Antoinette's story endures not because of how she lived in luxury, but because of how she faced loss. Because when everything that defined her was taken away, she revealed something the revolution could not destroy. A choice. The choice to remain human in a system determined to deny her that right. The guillotine destroyed her body, but it did not conquer her spirit. And in failing to do so, it left behind a question that history still struggles to answer. What is more dangerous to power, a tyrant clinging to privilege, or a victim who refuses to be reduced? If this story changed how you see the French Revolution, or made you question what justice really looks like when fear takes control, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the hidden horrors of history, the parts left out of textbooks and monuments, subscribe. Because the past is not just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, and what we're willing to confront when the silence finally breaks. Long after the shouting faded and the square returned to ordinary noise, Marie Antoinette's story continued to move beneath the surface of history like an unresolved wound. Nations prefer clean endings. Executions provide that, a moment where everything stops, where judgment feels complete. But the truth is never so contained. The violence done to her did not end with the blade, because the questions it raised could not be buried with her body. For years, official revolutionary narratives insisted her death was necessary, that she embodied everything the old order represented: excess, indifference, oppression. And yet, as archives slowly opened and eyewitness accounts surfaced, a contradiction emerged that could not be ignored. The punishment inflicted upon her far exceeded what was required to remove power. She had been neutralized long before she was killed. What followed was something else entirely. It was instruction. The revolution needed an example, not just defeat, but of total domination. It was not enough to remove the crown. The woman beneath it had to be erased. Her name stripped, her body exposed, her motherhood weaponized, her private grief turned into public theater. This was not justice measured in law. It was justice measured in submission. And yet submission never came. The more the system tightened around her, the more she retreated inward to a place it could not reach. Her silence was mistaken for weakness. Her restraint was mistaken for guilt. In reality, it was a boundary, a final territory she refused to surrender. Those who later tried to explain her composure often misunderstood it. They called it pride, arrogance, aristocratic detachment. But the accounts of those closest to her tell a different story. They describe exhaustion so complete that fear no longer functioned, a grief so absolute that nothing else could threaten it. When a person loses everything that gives life meaning, the threat of death loses its leverage. By the time she stepped into that cart, the revolution no longer held power over her inner world. This is a part history struggles with, because it disrupts simple moral frameworks. It is easier to believe cruelty produces obedience, easier to believe humiliation breaks the human spirit. Her story suggests something more unsettling, that beyond a certain point, cruelty loses its effectiveness, that when suffering becomes total, it can paradoxically strip fear of its power. That does not make the cruelty justified. It makes it pointless. The French Revolution wanted to replace one form of tyranny with reason, equality, and law. Yet in its most extreme phase, it adopted the very tools it claimed to despise: surveillance, dehumanization, public humiliation, psychological punishment. The language changed. The victims did not. Marie Antoinette's imprisonment reveals how quickly ideals can decay when fear becomes policy. How easily people convince themselves that someone deserves anything done to them, as long as the label is sufficient. Queen, traitor, enemy. Once the word is accepted, the person disappears. And that is where the true danger lies. Her execution did not end suffering. It normalized it. The guillotine did not restore moral balance. It accelerated moral erosion. Soon, those who had cheered her death found themselves accused with equal certainty. The same tribunals, the same rhetoric, the same certainty that violence was necessary. The machine did not stop because it had no reason to. It had learned efficiency. In that sense, Marie Antoinette's death was not a conclusion. It was a warning that went unheeded. When later generations revisited her story, the question was no longer whether she had been a good queen. That question felt small in comparison. The question became why her suffering had been so meticulously designed. Why isolation, surveillance, humiliation, and the destruction of motherhood were deemed appropriate tools of justice. Because if those tools were acceptable then, they could be acceptable again. Her calm in the face of death unsettled people not because it was noble, but because it was human. It revealed a truth many did not want to confront, that beneath propaganda and ideology, suffering feels the same. That humiliation does not become virtuous when wrapped in moral language. That cruelty does not become justice simply because the crowd approves. Marie Antoinette did not control how history remembered her life, but in her final months, she controlled something far more significant: how she responded to being stripped of everything. She did not answer hatred with hatred. She did not answer lies with spectacle. She answered them with restraint, with silence, with an apology spoken to the man who would kill her. That moment lingers because it does not fit the story people want to tell. It forces a reconsideration of power, of resistance, of what it truly means to break someone. Power assumes it wins when the body is destroyed. Resistance proves otherwise when the inner self remains intact. This does not absolve her of privilege or mistakes. It does not rewrite history into a fairy tale. It complicates it, and complexity is uncomfortable, especially in stories built on absolutes. That is why her suffering before the guillotine matters more than the execution itself. Because it reveals the anatomy of cruelty when a society decides someone must be erased not just physically, but psychologically. When humiliation becomes policy, when motherhood becomes leverage, when surveillance becomes routine, when silence becomes a weapon. These patterns are not confined to one era. They repeat wherever fear replaces restraint, wherever ideology replaces empathy, wherever people convince themselves that someone else is beyond dignity. Her story endures because it exposes that mechanism in its rawest form. The revolution could destroy her body. It could erase her name from records. It could bury her in an unmarked grave. But it could not control how her final moments would be remembered. And in failing to control that, it lost something it never intended to give away. A mirror. One that reflects not the excesses of monarchy, but the dangers of moral certainty without limits. Marie Antoinette was not destroyed by a blade. She was subjected to a system that tried, step by step, to unmake her as a human being. And when that system failed to do so, it revealed its own fragility. That is the legacy left behind. Not jewels, not palaces, but a reminder carved into history by silence, endurance, and a final act of humanity in a place built to deny it. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, her story still unsettles. Because it asks a question we would rather avoid. When fear demands cruelty and justice becomes performance, how many of us would recognize the moment dignity becomes resistance? If you want to keep exploring the hidden horrors of history, not just who died, but what was done to them before, subscribe and stay with me. Because the past is never as distant as we like to believe, and the line between justice and cruelty is thinner than history books admit.